He drove to that house only to say sorry. That was the plan. Walk up, knock, say the words, and leave. But when the door opened, he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at a child, a boy, maybe 8 years old, who had his eyes, his jaw, his scar. Someone had hidden this child from him for 9 years, and the person who did it was standing right in front of him, trembling, already beginning to close the door. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready for this emotional ride. Share this story with your friends and family, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on more thrilling tales like this. Let's get started. The rain came down like it had a grudge against something. Not the soft, forgiving kind, the violent kind. The kind that hammers rooftops and turns gutters into rivers and soaks through expensive fabric like it enjoys the irony. It fell in long, cold sheets across the narrow streets of the South Side, where the road had more cracks than the city had budgets to fix, where paint peeled from walls in long, tired strips, and where the neighbors knew better than to ask questions about unfamiliar black cars parked outside. Inside the SUV, Vincent Moretti sat completely still. His hands rested in his lap. His jaw was tight. His eyes were fixed on something outside the rain-blurred window, or maybe on nothing at all. From the outside, Vincent looked precisely like what the world had come to fear, broad-shouldered, composed, immovable, the kind of man who walked into a room and made other men recalculate their exits, il silenzioso. The old families used to call him, the silent one. Not because he was quiet, but because when he finally spoke, things had already been decided. 3 cities ran on his word. 2 governments owed him favors they'd never repay. His name alone had buried men deeper than any shovel. But tonight, in the back of this car, on this broken street, in this rain, Vincent Moretti looked like a man who was afraid. His driver, a stocky, gray-haired man named Sal, who had worked for him for over a decade, checked the rearview mirror for the 4th time. "Boss." Sal's voice was low, careful. "We've been here 11 minutes. Vincent said nothing. Sal cleared his throat. "You want me to circle the block again?" "No." The word dropped flat like something had already been decided. Vincent kept his eyes on the house. Number 14. The one with the pale blue door that had faded to almost nothing. A rusted gate that tilted like it had given up on standing straight years ago. One small window on the ground floor with the light on. A warm, amber square in all that gray, and a clay pot sitting on the front step holding a red flower that was somehow surviving the storm. He had the address on a folded piece of paper in his inside pocket. He'd been folding and unfolding it for 3 weeks. The crease along the center had started to split. He reached inside now, pulled it out, opened it. Maria Sanchez. The name was written in his own handwriting, given to him by a man he paid very generously to find people who didn't want to be found. A private investigator who had asked no questions and delivered a single envelope to Vincent's desk without a word, then left and never contacted him again. Maria Sanchez, 14 Callaway Lane. She had been his maid. 5 years she had worked inside his mansion, quiet, efficient, invisible in the way he'd preferred his staff to be invisible. She cooked, she cleaned, she moved through his home like a shadow, and Vincent had never once, in 5 full years, asked her where she'd grown up, or what she wanted, or whether she was happy. He hadn't seen her as a person. He had simply seen her as part of the household. And then, 9 years ago, on a cold Tuesday morning, she was gone. No notice, no goodbye. She had left her uniform folded neatly on the kitchen chair. She had not collected her final month's pay. She'd left only a single note written on the back of a grocery list in small, careful letters. "I'm sorry, Mr. Moretti, but I have to go." He had read that note once, put it down, and told himself it was not his concern. People in his world came and went. Loyalty was currency, and some people simply spent it early. He had replaced her within the week and hadn't thought of her again, not consciously, but her face had stayed. In the quiet corners of sleepless nights, in the kind of silence that lives inside very large, very empty houses. The face of someone he had looked past 1,000 times and never actually seen. 2 months ago, the investigator had delivered the envelope. And Vincent had learned something that had undone him in ways that 19 years of building an empire had never managed to do. Maria had left because she was pregnant, and the child, a boy, was his. Vincent folded the paper, pressed his thumb against the split crease, closed his eyes for a moment. As he told himself he was here for one reason only, a simple reason, an honest one even. He owed her an apology, not for the pregnancy he hadn't known, but for the 5 years before it, for every morning he had looked through her like she was furniture, for every word he'd spoken that landed like an order and not a conversation, for the quiet daily indignity of being invisible inside another person's home. He was here to say sorry. That was all. He had not prepared himself for anything else. He pressed open the door. The rain hit him the moment he stepped out, cold, immediate, indifferent to his suit. Sal materialized instantly with an umbrella. Vincent waved him off without looking and walked toward the gate alone. His shoes pressed into the soft, wet ground. He didn't notice. He pushed the gate open, climbed the 2 front steps. Ammon raised his fist. He knocked. The sound was swallowed by the rain. He waited. He knocked again, and then he heard it. Footsteps. Not heavy ones, soft, careful ones, the kind of footsteps that belong to someone who always checks who's at the door before they open it. A pause, a silence that lasted just a moment too long. Then the door opened, and there she was, Maria Sanchez, 9 years older, thinner than he remembered, her face more worn, her hair pulled back with a tiredness that hadn't been there before. She was holding a dish towel in both hands, like she'd been in the middle of something when the knock interrupted her. She looked at him, and the color left her face so completely, so immediately, that Vincent's carefully practiced opening sentence dissolved before it reached his lips. Maria." His voice came out softer than he intended. "I know this is unexpected. I came because—" He stopped. Because behind her, somewhere deeper in the small house, he heard something. Small footsteps. Running ones. And then a boy appeared in the doorway. He was perhaps 8 years old, wearing a school sweater slightly too large for his shoulders. His eyes were alert with the bright, unguarded curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to be careful around strangers. He looked up at Vincent, and Vincent's entire body stopped working. Not slowed. Stopped. Because the face looking up at him was a face he recognized in the deepest, most destabilizing way possible. Those eyes, sharp, dark, slightly too serious for a child his age. The same eyes that stared back at Vincent from every mirror he'd ever stood in front of. That jawline, square, strong, exactly the way Vincent's mother used to cup in her hands when he was small and say, "You have your grandfather's face, my love." And above the boy's right eyebrow, a small scar. Pale white, healed long ago, but still there, still visible. Vincent's hand moved without his permission. Slowly, he raised one finger and touched the identical scar above his own right eyebrow, the one he'd gotten at age 7, the one that had never fully disappeared. The world went silent. The rain, the street, the sound of Sal waiting by the car, all of it became background, irrelevant, unreachable. The boy looked up at him with those impossible eyes and said in a small and perfectly ordinary voice, "Mom." Who is that man?" And Maria's reaction was not what a person does when a former employer appears unannounced after 9 years. It was not surprise. It was not awkwardness. It was terror. The specific, ancient, been carrying this alone for years kind of terror. She grabbed the boy by the shoulder. Her knuckles went white around the dish towel, and in a voice so low and controlled it was almost frightening, she said, "Go inside, now." The boy looked between them once, then he disappeared back into the house. Maria turned to face Vincent. Their eyes met. And in that single, wordless moment, something slammed into his chest that had nothing to do with air or rain or the cold. He did the math. He didn't want to. He did it anyway. The way your mind performs calculations you haven't consented to, automatic and merciless. 9 years ago, Donna Maria had left. The boy was 8 years old. Vincent's voice, when it finally came, was barely a sound at all. "How old is he?" Maria said nothing. "Judith." His voice caught on her name. He hadn't meant to say the wrong name. He hadn't meant to say anything wrong. "Maria, how old is that boy?" She took one step back. She gripped the door frame. "You shouldn't have come here, Vincent." The door closed, the latch clicked, and Vincent Moretti, the man 3 cities feared, the man who had never once in his adult life felt the ground move beneath him, stood in the rain on a stranger's front step, completely alone, water running down his face, with a single question burning through every other thought in his mind like a lit match held to old paper. "Is this my son?" He walked back to the car slowly. Sal opened the door without a word, the way a good driver does when he can see that his employer is somewhere far beyond the reach of small talk. Vincent got in. The door closed. The rain continued. He sat in the silence. In front of him, behind the rain-blurred glass, the small house sat still, its pale blue door shut, its amber window glowing, that red flower still standing in the storm. 8 years old. He pressed his fingers to his forehead and closed his eyes. And for the first time in a very long time, the most feared man in the city had absolutely no idea what to do next. "Take me home," he said finally, too quietly. The kind of quiet that isn't peace, the kind that happens when a man's mind is so loud on the inside that nothing meaningful is left for the outside. Sal nodded once in the mirror and drove. They moved through the rain, past the market stalls, past the church on the corner with the hand-painted board that read, "God sees everything." Vincent's eyes drifted to it as they passed, and for the first time in his life, those 3 words did not feel neutral. They felt like a verdict. But to understand why Vincent Moretti was sitting in that car, in that rain, outside that house, you have to go back 9 years to the night everything started, to the night he first truly looked at Maria Sanchez and what that look cost them both. This is where the story begins. But to understand why Vincent Moretti was sitting in that car, in that rain, outside that house, you have to go back 9 years to the night everything started, to the night he first truly looked at Maria Sanchez and what that look cost them both. This is where the story begins. Sal drove. Vincent didn't see the streets. He saw the boy. That face kept returning, not as a memory yet, but as something more immediate than that, something that had embedded itself behind his eyes in the 30 seconds it had existed in front of him and refused to leave. The sharp gaze, the jaw, the scar, his scar. He had gotten it at 7 years old, fell from the oak tree behind his grandmother's house, hit a stone on the way down, cried for 20 minutes, then refused to cry again because his uncle had told him that Moretti men don't make noise when they bleed. He had never told that story to anyone outside his family. He had certainly never told Maria, so the scar on that boy's face had no explanation that didn't collapse everything Vincent thought he knew about the last 9 years. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and stared at the ceiling of the car. 8 years old. He ran the numbers again. He had been running them since the door closed, helplessly, the way you press a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. 9 years ago, Maria had left. 8 years ago, a child was born somewhere without him, without his name, without his knowledge, without anyone asking whether he deserved to know. That thought arrived with a sharpness he wasn't prepared for. He had expected guilt tonight. He had prepared for guilt, had driven here wearing it like a second suit, rehearsed the apology until it sat comfortably in his chest. What he had not prepared for was this particular species of loss, the kind that arrives fully formed, with no warning, for something you never knew you had. A son. The word sat in his mouth like something foreign. He had never spoken it about himself, never allowed himself to imagine it. Not because he didn't want children, but because his world had never left room for anything that soft. And now, someone had made that decision for him. He thought about Maria's face when she'd opened the door. He had expected discomfort. He had expected old resentment or the careful blankness of someone who had long since moved on. He had not expected terror. That was what it was. Not shock, not surprise. Terror. The kind that lives in the body, in the way her knuckles had gone white around that dish towel, in the way she had reached for the boy before she'd said a single word, placing herself between him and the child like a door swinging shut. She had been protecting him. From him. Vincent closed his eyes. He had told himself, driving over, that Maria had left because of something he'd done, some accumulation of dismissals and indignities that had finally become too heavy to carry. He'd been willing to own that. He had come to own it. But this was something else entirely. She had left carrying his child, had raised that boy alone, in that small house with the peeling fence and the rain-battered flower on the step, and she had done it in deliberate silence, had looked at that boy every single day for 8 years and chosen every single day to say nothing. Vincent had built his entire life on the belief that he controlled what happened around him. He had never once considered that someone might simply choose to leave him out of a story he was already in. The car slowed. The mansion gates opened. He didn't move. Why? The question was quieter now, but heavier. Why didn't you tell me, Maria? He had no answer, and for a man who had spent 20 years ensuring he always had answers, that silence was the most frightening thing he had felt all night. He didn't sleep. He sat in his study until the rain stopped and the sky outside shifted from black to the pale, indifferent gray of early morning. His phone had buzzed 17 times. He had answered none of them. Somewhere in the house, his staff moved quietly through their routines. Coffee brewed, curtains drawn, the soft sounds of a household performing itself, and Vincent sat behind his desk and didn't move. In front of him, a single manila envelope, the same one the investigator had delivered 2 months ago, the one that had started all of this. He had read it 3 times when it first arrived. And then he had locked it in the bottom drawer and told himself he needed time to think before he acted. 2 months. 2 months of thinking, and what he had actually done was nothing. He had let the knowledge sit inside him like a stone, growing heavier with every week he chose not to move. He opened the drawer now, pulled the envelope out, laid it flat on the desk. The investigator's name was Rains, a quiet, unremarkable man who charged an extraordinary amount of money to find things people had buried. Vincent had used him twice before, both times for business. Both times Rains had delivered clean, efficient information with no editorializing. This time, he had included a single handwritten line at the bottom of the report. "I'm sorry, Mr. Moretti." Vincent hadn't understood why the first time he read it. He understood now. The report was thorough. Maria Elena Sanchez had left his employ 9 years ago on a Tuesday. She had not returned to her mother's apartment in the district where she'd grown up. She had not contacted her 2 sisters for nearly 4 months after her disappearance. She had instead moved to a rented room in the South Side, paid for in cash under a neighbor's name, and had remained largely invisible for the better part of a year. 8 months after she left his mansion, she had given birth to a boy. The birth certificate listed the father's name as unknown. Unknown. Vincent set the page down, picked it up again, put it back. He made himself continue reading. The boy's name was Gabriel. Gabriel Sanchez. He had been enrolled in the local primary school 2 years ago. His teacher's notes, though somehow obtained by Rains through means Vincent hadn't asked about, described him as exceptionally bright, quietly determined, and unusually self-possessed for his age. Vincent stared at that phrase for a long time, unusually self-possessed for his age. He thought about the boy in the doorway, the way he had looked at Vincent without flinching, curious, but not afraid. The way he'd asked his question simply, directly, without the nervous energy most children carried around strangers. He thought about where that quality came from. And then, against his will, he began to remember. Maria had worked for him for 5 years. 5 years, and Vincent could count on one hand the number of times he had looked at her directly, not past her, at her. He remembered the morning he had sent back a report she'd typed for him, not because it was wrong, but because the margins were slightly wider than he preferred. He had left it on the kitchen counter with a single word written across the top in red pen. Again. She had redone it without comment, left the corrected version in the same spot by the following morning. He remembered the evening he had hosted 14 people for dinner and had spoken to every single one of them, partners, rivals, strangers, and had not once acknowledged the woman who had spent 11 hours preparing the meal, who had stood in the kitchen until midnight cleaning up while he laughed in the next room. He had never thanked her. Not once. Not in 5 years. He had never asked her name day, never noticed when she was tired, never wondered what she went home to at night, or whether, in those final months, she had anywhere to go home to at all. The question arrived slowly, the way the worst ones always do. She had been pregnant while she worked for him. She had been carrying his child, afraid, alone, invisible inside his house, and he had handed her back a report with a single red word written across the top. Again. Vincent pressed both hands flat against the desk. Could he have abandoned his own son all those years ago? Not with a decision, not with cruelty, but simply by never once paying enough attention to know that a life was beginning right inside his own home? The answer sat in front of him, quiet and immovable. He already knew it. He gave her 3 days. Not out of patience. Vincent Moretti had never been a patient man. He gave her 3 days because some part of him understood that showing up twice in a week would slam whatever door remained between them shut permanently. So he waited. He went through the motions of his days, meetings, calls, decisions that affected people he'd never meet. And underneath all of it, the question continued burning. On the 4th morning, he drove himself. No Sal, no convoy. A plain, dark car that drew no attention on Callaway Lane. He arrived just after 8 when the street was quiet and the red flower on her step was catching the first thin light of the day. He knocked. She took longer to answer this time, long enough that he wondered if she'd seen him through the window and was deciding. Long enough that he had already begun composing the things he would say to a closed door. But it opened. Maria stood in the frame, her expression arranged into something carefully neutral, the face of a woman who had spent the last 3 days preparing for exactly this moment. "He's at school," she said, before Vincent could speak. "I know." He hadn't come for the boy. Not yet. "I came for you." She stepped back. Let him in. The house was small and precisely kept, the kind of order that comes not from comfort, but from effort. From someone who had learned that control over small things was the only reliable kind. A child's drawing was pinned to the wall beside the kitchen door. Bright colors, a house, 2 figures, a woman and a boy. Only 2 figures. Vincent looked at it for a moment, then looked away. They sat at the kitchen table. Maria wrapped both hands around a mug she didn't drink from. Vincent placed the investigator's report between them. She looked at it. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look surprised. "You already knew I'd found you," he said. "I suspected." Her voice was steady. "When you showed up at the door, you weren't here by accident." "No." He folded his hands. "Tell me why, Maria." A long silence. "Which part?" "All of it." She set the mug down, looked at the table, and then slowly she began. She had known she was pregnant before she left, 6 weeks. She had stood in the bathroom of his mansion, his marble, $40,000 bathroom, and held the test in her hands and understood with complete clarity that there was no version of this story that ended safely inside his world. She had seen what Vincent's world did to people who became inconvenient. She had cleaned the study where the conversations happened. She had heard the names that stopped being mentioned. She had watched quietly and invisibly the way his world consumed things it couldn't categorize. A child, his child, born to his maid, would not be categorizable. "I wasn't afraid of you," she said. Her eyes met his for the first time. "I was afraid of what you'd become if I told you. Whether you'd want him, whether you wouldn't." Both answers terrified me. Vincent said nothing. If you'd claimed him, he would have grown up inside all of this. Her hand moved slightly, a gesture that encompassed everything unseen. "I couldn't give him that life. And if I hadn't?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Vincent sat with that for a moment, the weight of it, the impossible position she had stood in alone, in a borrowed bathroom, at 6 weeks, with no good options and no one to ask. He understood it. It still carved something out of him. You didn't give me the choice," he said quietly. No accusation in it, just the fact laid flat. "No," Maria said, "I didn't." The honesty of it silenced them both. Vincent looked toward the drawing on the wall, the 2 figures, the absent third. "Is there anything else?" he asked. The question was simple, but something shifted in Maria's face, barely perceptible, the way a light changes behind frosted glass. Her hands tightened around the mug again. She opened her mouth, closed it. "No," she said. But her eyes said something else entirely. "But is there more to this story than just the boy?" Vincent looked at her for a long moment. He had spent 20 years reading rooms, reading people, reading the precise weight of a silence. This silence had a shape. and it wasn't finished yet. He couldn't let the silence go. That was the thing about Vincent Moretti. He had built everything he owned on the refusal to leave a room before he understood it completely. And Maria's face, in that final moment before the conversation ended, had been a room with something still inside it. He called Rains that same evening. "Go deeper," he said. "Not Maria. Go around her. Bank records, phone logs, anything that touches the timeline of when she left, 9 years ago. Start there." Rains asked no questions. He never did. The file arrived 4 days later, thicker this time. Rains had included a single typed note on top. "You may want to sit down for this one." Vincent read it standing. 3 weeks before Maria had left his employ, a wire transfer had been made from a private account into a bank in Maria's name. The amount was significant. Enough to cover rent for 2 years, medical expenses, living costs, enough to disappear on. The private account did not belong to Vincent. It belonged to Hannah Moretti, his wife. Vincent set the page down, picked it up, read the account number again, checked the date against the timeline in the first report. 15 days before Maria left. 15 days before the note on the kitchen chair, before the folded uniform, before, "I'm sorry, Mr. Moretti, but I have to go." Hannah had known. He sat with that fact for a long time. Hannah had known Maria was pregnant, had known, or suspected, whose child it was. And rather than bring it to Vincent, rather than ask him, accuse him, confront him with any of it, she had gone directly to Maria, had offered money. That had made the problem disappear the way wealthy women of a certain kind make problems disappear, quietly, efficiently, and with enough distance that their hands appeared clean. Vincent thought about Hannah's face, the wide smile in the photograph on his desk, the blue dress, the pearl earrings. He had grieved her genuinely, had sat in that enormous house after she died and felt her absence like a structural failure, like a wall removed that he hadn't known was load-bearing. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. She had known he had a son. She had known, and she had paid a frightened, pregnant woman to vanish, had left that woman to raise a child alone in a rented room under a neighbor's name, had let 8 years pass, had lived inside their marriage, had slept beside him, had smiled for photographs, and had said nothing. Odd, not once, not even at the end, when she must have known the end was coming, not even then. The rage arrived slowly, which made it worse. The fast kind burns and passes. This kind settled, low, quiet, and total, into the foundation of everything he thought he had known about his life. He stood, walked to the window. The city continued below, indifferent and precise the way cities always are. He thought about Gabriel, 8 years old, drawing pictures with 2 figures. He thought about Hannah, arranging all of this from a distance, with a wire transfer and a silence that had lasted nearly a decade. And then a colder thought arrived. Hannah had been meticulous, controlled. She did nothing carelessly, and she did nothing alone, which meant the wire transfer was only what Rains had found. How far did they go to keep this secret? Aunt Vincent turned from the window. He needed to know everything, all of it, every layer, every arrangement, every person who had stood between him and his son and chosen to say nothing. He picked up his phone. "Rains," he said when the line connected. "Find out who else knew." Raymond Voss lived in a townhouse on the north side of the city. Clean stone facade, brass fixtures, the kind of address that announced money without shouting it. Hannah's older brother had always been careful that way. Careful about appearances, careful about associations, careful about the precise distance he maintained between himself and the parts of Vincent's world he found distasteful, while never once refusing the benefits that world provided. Vincent had always understood Raymond. He had simply never had cause to look at him directly. Until now. Out he arrived without calling ahead. Raymond's housekeeper opened the door, saw Vincent's face, and stepped aside without a word. Vincent walked through the entrance hall and found Raymond in his sitting room, reading glasses on, a newspaper open across his knee. The careful performance of a man who had been waiting for this visit and had decided that composure was his best defense. He looked up. His expression didn't change. "Vincent." "Put the paper down, Raymond." He did. Vincent sat across from him. He placed Rains's file on the coffee table between them, opened to the page with the wire transfer, Hannah's account number visible, the date circled in ink. Raymond looked at it, looked back up. How long have you known? Vincent asked. A pause. The kind that isn't hesitation, the kind that is calculation. Hannah told me when it happened, Raymond said, when she found out about the girl. The girl, Vincent's voice stayed flat. Her name is Maria. She raised my son alone for 8 years. Call her by her name. Raymond's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. How much did you know? I knew Hannah arranged for her to leave. I knew there was a child. He removed his glasses, set them on the arm of the chair with the deliberate care of a man choosing his next words carefully. I told Hannah it was a mistake, that it would surface eventually. And she said? She said she could manage it. Vincent looked at him for a long moment. She said she could manage it, as though Gabriel were a logistical problem, as though 8 years of a child's life were an inconvenience to be administered from a distance, but with wire transfers and well-maintained silences. You let her, Vincent said. She was my sister. He is my son. The words landed between them like something physical. Raymond looked away first. Vincent stood. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. That had always been the thing people misunderstood about him. The stillness was not calm. It was concentration. You sat across from me at dinners, Vincent said. For 8 years. You came to my home. You shook my hand. You looked me in the eye. Raymond said nothing. You watched me grieve her. His voice dropped lower. After she died, you sat beside me at her funeral, and you said, I remember exactly what you said. You said, she kept nothing from you, Vincent. She loved you completely. The silence in the room was total. Raymond's hands, Vincent noticed, were not steady. Good. I'm going to find out every name, Vincent said quietly. Every person who knew, every arrangement that was made. And when I have all of it, he picked up the file. We'll speak again. He walked to the door. Behind him, Raymond finally spoke. His voice was low, strained with something that might have been guilt or might have simply been fear. Vincent, the boy, is he safe? Vincent stopped. The question had a shape he didn't like. Not the shape of an uncle concerned for a child's welfare, something tighter than that, something that knew a specific answer might be required. He turned slowly. Why wouldn't he be? Raymond opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes moved, just slightly, to the left, the involuntary direction of a man remembering something he hadn't yet said. Raymond, Vincent's voice was very quiet now. What did you just not tell me? Can Vincent get to Gabriel before it's too late? Raymond set his glasses down carefully on the table and began to speak. Raymond's words had sent Vincent moving. He'd made 3 calls from the car, redirected 2 of his most trusted men to Callaway Lane, not visibly, not in a way that would frighten anyone, just a quiet presence on the street. A precaution. Until he understood the full shape of what Raymond had told him, Gabriel would not be unobserved. That had been 4 days ago. Now, the men were still there. The threat Raymond had outlined was being handled, carefully, and with the particular efficiency Vincent reserved for things that mattered most to him. But today was not about that. Today he had called ahead. Maria opened the door before he knocked. She had seen him coming. He understood that now about her. She was a woman who always heard things approaching before they arrived. It had probably kept her safe these 9 years. It had probably kept Gabriel safe. He had stopped resenting her for it. He knows you're coming, she said. Her voice was carefully measured, the way it always was now. Not cold, just controlled. I told him you were someone I used to work for, someone who wanted to say hello. That's all right, Vincent said. We have time. Something moved across her face at that. Not quite relief, not quite fear. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. She stepped back. Let him in. Gabriel was sitting at the kitchen table. He had a book open in front of him, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching the doorway, alert, composed. Not with that quality the teacher's report had described and Vincent now recognized as inherited, unusually self-possessed for his age. He stood when Vincent entered, not because he'd been told to, simply because it seemed to him like the appropriate thing to do. Vincent felt something move through his chest that he had no word for. Hi, the boy said. Hello, Gabriel. A pause. The boy looked at him with frank, unhurried curiosity, the kind that doesn't flinch. Mom said you knew her before I was born. That's right. From work? Yes. Gabriel considered this the way children consider things when they are deciding whether the adult in front of them is worth further investment. Then, apparently satisfied with whatever conclusion he'd reached, he pulled out the chair beside him. "You can sit down if you want," he said. "I'm doing maths. It's not very hard, but it takes a while." Vincent sat down. They stayed at that table for 2 hours. Gabriel talked about school, about a book he was reading about deep-sea fish, about the fact that his teacher had spelled his name wrong on his last assignment, and he had corrected her, politely, in front of the class. He talked the way children talk when they feel safe, freely, without architecture, jumping from one thing to the next and expecting you to keep up. Vincent kept up. He said little. He didn't need to. He was learning the shape of his son, the rhythms of him, the humor that surfaced sideways in the middle of ordinary sentences, the way he tapped his pencil when he was thinking, the way he laughed, short and sudden, like he hadn't planned to. Vincent had his laugh, had his hands, had his grandmother's eyes. Out across the kitchen, Maria stood with her back against the counter, arms folded, watching. Not intervening, not retreating, just watching. When Gabriel disappeared to his room to fetch the fish book, urgently because there was a specific page he needed Vincent to see, Vincent looked across at her. "Thank you," he said. Maria looked at him for a moment, her arms loosened slightly. "He asked me last night," she said quietly, "if you were going to come back." Vincent held her gaze. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." "And now?" She looked toward the hallway where Gabriel had disappeared. Something in her face shifted, not softness exactly, but the beginning of a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. "Now," she said, "I think I do." Gabriel reappeared in the doorway, which book held open triumphantly to a photograph of an anglerfish. "Look at this," he said, entirely serious. "It makes its own light, in complete darkness. It just makes it." Vincent looked at the photograph. Then he looked at his son. "Will the world allow them to heal?" "That's remarkable," Vincent said. Gabriel nodded firmly, as though this had always been obvious and he was simply glad someone else had finally noticed. 3 weeks passed. Vincent came to Callaway Lane every Tuesday and Thursday, always in the plain dark car, always without convoy. He had been careful, deliberately, methodically careful, about keeping those two worlds separated by as much distance as geography and discipline allowed. Gabriel now expected him. That fact alone, the simple, staggering fact that his son had begun to expect him, had rearranged something fundamental inside Vincent's chest. The boy would have his book ready, or a question he'd been saving, or some new piece of information about deep-sea creatures, or ancient engineering, or the specific aerodynamics of paper planes that he delivered with the gravity of a man presenting research findings. Vincent had started arriving 10 minutes early. He told himself it was to avoid traffic. The first sign came on a Wednesday. Sal noticed it, a car parked at the end of Callaway Lane that hadn't been there the previous week. Different plates on Thursday, same model, same position, watching. Sal mentioned it quietly, the way he always mentioned things he considered Vincent's business, briefly, without alarm, and only once. Vincent said nothing. He made a call that evening. By Friday morning, he knew who the car belonged to. Carlo Riva. An old name, an old problem. One Vincent had considered resolved 4 years ago when a business arrangement between their families had been formally, if coldly, dissolved. Carlo had accepted the dissolution with too much grace at the time. Vincent had noted it and filed it away under revisit. He should have revisited it sooner. The second sign came from Raymond, a message, not a call, a written message, delivered by hand to Vincent's office, which meant Raymond was afraid of phone records. It read, "They know about the boy, not just Carlo. Others. The story has moved. You need to move faster." Vincent read it twice, burned it. He sat in his office for 11 minutes, he knew because he watched the clock, doing the precise, cold mathematics of his situation. Gabriel's existence had been a secret for 8 years, contained, protected by Maria's silence and Hannah's arrangements and the general invisibility of a woman and child living quietly in the South Side. But Vincent had moved. He had hired Rains, he had gone to Raymond, he had driven a car to Callaway Lane twice a week for 3 weeks. And in his world, movement created information. Information created leverage, and leverage in the hands of the wrong people created threats. He had brought this to their door. The understanding arrived without self-pity. He didn't have the luxury of that, just the clean, cold recognition of cause and consequence, and the immediate question of what came next. He went to Maria that evening. Unscheduled, she read his face before he spoke. And he had noticed she did this, absorbed information from posture and expression the way other people absorbed it from words. "How serious?" she asked. "Serious enough?" She sat down. Her hands were still. He had come to understand that her stillness was not passivity. It was the same quality Gabriel had, the same inheritance, the ability to hold something difficult without letting it move you before you were ready. "What do you need?" she asked. Not what does this mean, or what have you done, or any of the things she had every right to ask. What do you need? Vincent looked at her. "I need to move you both," he said. "Somewhere I can control. Somewhere they won't find you while I handle this." Maria held his gaze for a long moment. "And Gabriel?" she asked quietly. "How do we explain it to him? He's 8, Vincent." "Oh, he'll know something is wrong." "I know." "He'll ask questions." "I know." Vincent paused. "Tell him the truth, as much of it as he can hold." A silence settled between them, not the heavy kind they had once shared across a kitchen table. Something different, the kind that exists between two people who have stopped negotiating and started deciding. "If they come for him," Maria began. "They won't," Vincent said. His voice carried the specific weight of a man who was not offering reassurance. He was making a statement of intent, the kind he had made many times before about many things, and had always, without exception, kept. "What will happen if they come for Gabriel?" Maria looked at him, and for the first time since he had appeared in her doorway in the rain, she didn't look afraid. She looked like she believed him. That, Aunt Vincent thought, was the most important thing that had happened yet. He picked up his phone. It was time to stop being careful. He called the meeting himself. That was the first thing they would have noticed. Not the location, not the guest list, but the fact that Vincent Moretti had initiated it. In 20 years, he had never called a table together for anything personal. Business was business. The personal life of a man in his position was a liability to be minimized, not a subject to be brought before other men with competing interests. But Gabriel was not a liability, and Vincent was done minimizing. The room held 7 men, old names, significant ones, the kind of men who had known Vincent since before the empire, who had watched him build it, who had profited alongside him. And who now sat around a long table with careful expressions and the particular stillness of people who understood that the temperature of this meeting had not yet been established. Carlo Riva sat at the far end. He had come. Vincent had expected that. Carlo was too intelligent to refuse and too arrogant to arrive looking nervous. He sat with his hands folded and his chin slightly raised and his eyes moving the way they always moved, calculating distance. Vincent stood at the head of the table and didn't sit. "I'll be brief," he said. "I have a son. His name is Gabriel. He is 8 years old and he lives on Callaway Lane with his mother. And as of this morning, they are no longer there. So whatever you thought you knew about their location is already useless." The room was very still. "He is not a pressure point," Vincent continued. "Yes, he is not a negotiation. He is not a message you send me or a door you knock on or a car you park at the end of a street." His eyes moved to Carlo, stayed there. "He is my son. And the next person who attempts to use that fact as leverage will find that I become a version of myself they have not previously encountered." Carlo held his gaze, said nothing. The other 6 men said nothing. The meeting lasted 4 more minutes, procedural, conclusive. The kind of ending that doesn't require further discussion because everyone in the room understands that the discussion is already over. Gabriel was waiting when Vincent arrived, a safe house, warm, well-staffed, chosen for its distance from everything familiar and its proximity to everything Vincent could control. Maria had packed efficiently and without complaint. Now Gabriel had brought the fish book and a backpack and had asked in the car, with characteristic directness, whether they were in trouble. Vincent had told him, not anymore. Gabriel had accepted this with a single nod and returned to his book. Now he was sitting on the front step in the late afternoon light, turning a stone over in his hand the way children do when their minds are working on something they haven't yet put into words. He looked up when Vincent approached. "Are we going to be okay?" he asked. Simply, directly, the question of a boy who had decided that the man in front of him was someone worth asking. Vincent sat beside him on the step. He thought about 20 years of building walls and calling it strength. He thought about Maria in a rented room, alone, making impossible decisions. Yet he thought about a birth certificate with the word unknown printed where his name should have been. He thought about an anglerfish, making its own light in complete darkness. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Yes," he said, "we are." Gabriel looked at him for a moment. Then he leaned slightly, just slightly, into the weight of Vincent's hand. The smallest possible gesture, the most significant one. "Okay," he said. The afternoon held them both in its quiet light. Somewhere inside, Maria moved through the rooms of the house, and for the first time in 9 years, the sound of her footsteps did not carry the weight of someone always preparing to leave. Vincent kept his hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm here, Gabriel," he said quietly, "and I'm never leaving again." Gabriel turned the stone over one more time. Then he set it down on the step beside him. Carefully, deliberately, the way you set something down when you've decided you no longer need to hold on to it. "I know," he said. And somehow, in the simple confidence of those 2 words, Vincent heard the thing he hadn't known he'd been waiting 9 years to receive. Not forgiveness. Not yet. That would take time, and time was something they finally had. Just belief. His son believed him. It was enough to begin. The road ahead would not be easy. There were still names on Rains's list, still conversations with Raymond that hadn't reached their end, still a boy who would one day be old enough to ask questions that deserved complete answers. But Vincent Moretti had built an empire from nothing, in a world that rewarded neither softness nor hesitation. He could build this too. He would. Now, if you were moved by Vincent's journey and the shocking revelations, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Subscribe to stay connected for more powerful, emotional content. And as always, let us know your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you.